Hello, BookTube, and welcome to ShakeTube 2017. This is an informal Shakespeare read-along that was organized by Luukashist Books and Curtis Books and Film, in which we take one Shakespeare play a week until the beginning of December, read it, think about it, and then make a video about it. It's kind of like a read-along and and kind of not. And every week on Friday or Saturday or whatever, I get to see videos by people, including a lot of booktubers, at least one every week, a booktuber I didn't know about before, uh, responding to these plays. And the one we're doing this week is The Merchant of Venice, which is the story of a young Venetian nobleman named Bassanio, who's in love with a woman, a wealthy heiress called Portia, and needs a sum of money to woo her. And he doesn't have it. He doesn't have the money. So he goes to his friend, the titular merchant of Venice, Antonio, who is a wealthy merchantman, and asks him for a loan of the money. But at the moment, all of Antonio's merchant vessels are out at sea. He has no ready cash. But he's good for it. And all of Venice knows he's good for it. And he himself is completely sure that he's good for it. So he goes to a Jewish moneylender named Shylock for the loan. And Shylock makes him the loan interest-free with the stipulation that if he can't pay it, Shylock is entitled to a pound of his flesh. And Antonio thinks nothing of it. He agrees to the terms. And in fact, he considers them generous. And so Bassanio has the money and goes off to Belmont, where Portia lives. And a large chunk of the play is devoted to that wooing and winning. He eventually does win and marry Portia. But in the meantime, back in Venice, news comes that all of Antonio's ships have been lost at sea. And he has no money. He still has his ship in concern, but there's no possible way that he can repay the bond to Shylock. And so Shylock demands a pound of flesh, which of course would be fatal. Word of this gets to Belmont and Bassanio and Portia. Portia is wealthy and agrees to send far more than the bond in cash back to satisfy Shylock, and also goes to Venice in person, dressed as a man, dressed as a lawyer. And Shylock refuses to be repaid in cash, even though it's far more than he lent. He wants his pound of flesh. And so it goes to court. It goes before the Duke of Venice, who doesn't want to lose Antonio, likes him. Everybody in the play likes Antonio except Shylock, but he's constricted by the law. And so we have a court scene in which Portia, disguised as a lawyer, is famously arguing with Shylock for mercy, which Shylock refuses. And Portia then thwarts him with hair splitting by saying, "Well, yes, you agreed to a pound of flesh, but not a pound of anything else. Nothing else. No blood. No tegumentary tissue. Nothing like that. Just flesh. And if you're even a slight bit over a pound, if you exact more than a pound, then you lose everything. You lose your life." And Shylock realizes that he's been bested, that these technicalities mean that he can't exact his pound of flesh. And further revenges are taken upon him, his estates, his wealth, even his faith. He's told to convert to Christianity. All summed up in a happy ending for the play. And as you can guess, I mean, if you're not familiar with The Merchant of Venice, you can probably guess from that summary that people have had problems with this play for a long time. Not in Shakespeare's day. In Shakespeare's day, the figure of the rapacious Jewish moneylender was common. It was an ordinary boogeyman in fiction. And not for a long time after that, because there weren't really any Jews in England in Shakespeare's day, or for a long time after that. They had been banished a long time, centuries before. Technically, they were still in major cities, but not as a self-identifying public group usually. So it was easy to make a lampooning figure of them. But as you know, as time went on, and especially especially in the 20th century, uh, just exactly what you do with the Merchant of Venice has become more and more of a pressing question. I'm very happy to report that the play is still staged. You'd be hard pressed to miss it in the Shakespeare calendar of any major theater uh, anywhere in the Western world. It's a popular Shakespeare play, in other words. Uh, but even really experienced Shakespearean critics are made a little uncomfortable about it. They don't quite know what to do with it. For instance, the Shakespearean critic that we're reading along with here, Harold Bloom, who wrote Shakespeare: The Invention of the Human, he has a very long and very thoughtful chapter on the Merchant of Venice, on exactly this point. And you can tell that he's having trouble with it because he contradicts himself a couple of times in that essay. Opens right away by calling the play anti-Semitic. Later on says it would be disappointing if you wrote it off as an anti-Semitic farce. Uh, and rereading it, I, of course, was reminded over and over again of something that I have been thinking about for a week since since it appeared. One of my favorite booktubers, Erik Karl Anderson, a week ago, made a video called "How Should We Read the Classics?" He was responding to stories in Boccaccio's Decameron, which is the subject of another read-along, Decamerama, being hosted by Adam at Memento Mori. And Erik posted a video that I found horrifying, which is really hard. It's really interesting, but it's really hard. When a booktuber you adore makes a video that you consider to be almost completely wrong-headed, I didn't know. I must have watched that video a dozen times by now, trying to latch onto it, trying to make sense of it, and most of all, wishing that Erik were sitting here in this room with me and that we could just talk this out, because this is a really smart, really sensitive, and really experienced reader. If you read his blog, The Lonesome Reader, or if you've watched his videos and taken recommendations from him, you will see that he is invaluable as a guide, especially to contemporary literature. But in his video, he was taking Boccaccio to task for sexism and sexual predation and a whole bunch of other things that Boccaccio would not have understood at all. He was saying that we shouldn't give classics like these a free pass when they promulgate ideas that we now consider to be horrific. I've watched. I still haven't, as you can tell, I still haven't made my peace with this video, and I watched it right away. I watched it before it had any comments, and when I watched it, I thought, I'm not going to want to read the comments to this video. And yet I knew that I wouldn't be able not to. And I was right. I was right. Every time I went back and there were more comments, the comments were more and more frustrating. There were people in the comments field who said, well, I don't read the classics specifically because of all their isms, their racism, their sexism. There was a comment by another booktuber I adore, Matthew Sharapa, one of our best booktubers, who made a comment in which he said that yes, we shouldn't give these classics a free pass. We might love them, but we have to hold them accountable. And in his own comment to the video, said something that I knew was coming. I wished that it didn't come from him, and it infuriated me, as it always does. He took the gambit of saying, I look on any negative comments to this video as just a sign that the person isn't self-aware enough. Toot court. Not caring what the negative comment is. If there's a negative reaction to what you're saying at all, if anyone in this comments field disagrees with you at all about holding 400-year classics accountable for 21st century Western American morals, then it's just that they're not woke enough. The only reason they're objecting is because they haven't examined themselves enough. I had a feeling that such a comment was coming. I wished that it hadn't come from a booktuber that I love. And of course I read it. You can guess what my reaction was. I was infuriated with someone a third my age telling me that I haven't thought deeply enough about the literature to which I've devoted my life. I can't stand any kind of objection that precludes listening. And saying, well, if you disagree with me, it's just that you're not enlightened enough, is that kind of objection. And it got worse. The comments got worse, as I knew they would. Sure enough, someone brought up a contemporary work. In this case, it was To Kill a Mockingbird, but it could be almost anything. And another person said, not only do I not read the classics, but they shouldn't be published. They shouldn't be taught. They shouldn't be reprinted. And they shouldn't be reprinted. They shouldn't be published. They shouldn't be taught. Well, you don't need me to tell you. That is one easy step away. I am not far, not 5 steps. That is one easy step away from they should be burned. This kind of thinking is anti-literary. I don't know what accounts for it in this case. I don't know what accounts for it. I know, I don't know these people. I haven't sat in the room with them. If Matthew Sharapa or Erik Karl Anderson comes to SteveCon 2018, then we will hash it out. And I feel certain, having watched their videos, that we will not end up fundamentally disagreeing. That's the thing about passionate, life-involved book readers. They tend not to disagree on the big stuff. I feel certain that something is lost in the translation here, and that to my face, Matthew Sharapa would not say, well, the only reason that you don't agree that we should censor Boccaccio because of his sexism is because you haven't thought about it enough. And I feel certain that in conversation, Erik Karl Anderson would more readily admit a degree of the absurdity of holding a 14th or 13th century author accountable for 21st century Western morals that aren't even held by all of the 21st century. There is no sexism in Boccaccio's Decameron that's anywhere close to as bad as the sexism that is practiced in half the modern world in the 21st century. That brings us right around to The Merchant of Venice, which, according to the yardstick of Erik's video, and certainly the yardstick applied in the comments to that video, you would never read The Merchant of Venice again. Seeing what you see, seeing this cartoonishly evil Jewish moneylender as a villain, you would never do it. And, it's not the only one. You go through the Western canon, including universally beloved authors who aren't criticized as, well, they had the antediluvian attitudes of their day, but we love them anyway. Oh, no, authors who escape that completely, who still routinely, the Victorians, as all the people involved in Victober will tell you, in Victorian fiction it is the most common thing in the world for someone pressed for money to wonder whether or not they should go to the Jews. And that's because the Jews are stereotypically considered rapacious moneylenders. Are we going to get rid of all of Dickens? All of Trollope? Jane Austen? The Bronte sisters? Are we going to do that? That's the thing that killed me about Erik's video, is that it was a juvenile response to reading. Totally out of place with all of the rest of his responses to reading. I've learned so much about contemporary literature from this young man. To hear him going on about maybe we need to just destroy the whole canon and, by implication, build a new one along our own lines was unimaginable. And there it is. I'm hoping that he makes a follow-up video. I'm hoping that his own video is stuck with him the way it stuck with me, and that he makes a follow-up video. Because, of course, that is the ultimate slippery slope, and it doesn't take more than a second to realize that. Erik Karl Anderson and the people in his comments field have gone to zoos. They wear leather. They eat animal flesh. And a million other things that we aren't even thinking about. For instance, every single person involved in that discussion who agreed with his stance of holding Boccaccio accountable to our current Western American East and West Coast views of women's equality, every single one of those people currently enslaves an artificial intelligence. They all have cell phones. How do you know that in 200 years, people aren't going to look back at your archived BookTube videos and say, well, he's using an artificial intelligence to film this video without its consent? You might think that's absurd, but it's not. It's no more absurd than saying that a figure from centuries past, where the subject population was enslaved, women were slaves, Jews were slaves, and thought of that way, and had never been thought of otherwise, to go back at these works and say, well, that's pretty unenlightened, dude. I didn't say dude. But anyway, you can see where this presents a problem with The Merchant of Venice. And it's a totally wrong-headed one, and I've never understood why critics don't see that. Yes, Shakespeare was anti-Semitic. You could hardly breathe the air of Elizabethan England without being anti-Semitic. Of course he was. He didn't even think not to be, except to the extent that he thought about it enough to make a character like Shylock, who's by far the most compelling and three-dimensional character in the play, and will, despite his cartoonish treatment, leave you walking out of the theater thinking about the humanity of this Jewish moneylender. And why? well, this is the thing that's always confused me about the knee-jerk reactions to The Merchant of Venice, is that all of this antagonism is coming about because Shylock is Jewish. I've never understood that. Shakespeare goes out of his way in this play to tell us that Antonio, the Merchant of Venice, and Shylock are longtime enemies. They've hated each other for years, mainly because of Antonio, because of his anti-Semitism. It's stated outright. Antonio has always been savagely anti-Semitic in a way that, for instance, the Duke of Venice or a lot of the other characters are not. They just are not. He takes it to an extreme. And not only does Shylock resent that, but Shylock also has just lost his daughter to a Christian. She not only ran away with a Christian man, but changed her religion. And when she was running away, she not only stole a large amount of his money, she also stole a ring that had been given to him by his late wife. If that's not a human detail, a humanizing detail, I don't know what is. In other words, we are given a lot of explanations for why Shylock would maniacally insist on a pound of flesh that doesn't have anything to do with his Jewishness. I think that was intentional, and I think it adds a lot of depth to the play that is still anti-Semitic, and that we should still read. It is deeply and troublingly anti-literary to say that we should not read The Merchant of Venice, because if we do, we're giving it a pass for anti-Semitism. That is wrong. That is I know it drives some of you crazy when I say there's a wrong and a right way to do this sort of thing, but that is the wrong way to read. That is a juvenile way to read. That these texts aren't here for that, and it's not your place anyway. It's as you can see, it's an open question, and you know, it's, in this case, more than I'm always interested in what all of you have to say, but in this case, more than most, I would like to know in my own comments field, and I'm hoping that none of you make comments that give me conniptions. I'm hoping that none of you say this play should be burned or banned or not published or not taught anymore or not performed. God forbid. Imagine not going to a theater and seeing the I would love to hear in the comments field if for instance, if you've read The Merchant of Venice, did you have problems with it? These kind of problems with it, and how bad were they? How deep did the problems run? Would they, for instance, did they stop you from reading it, the rest of it? Did they stop you in mid-read? Or, you know, did the play strike you as actually anti-Semitic? Or just anti-Shylock? And all the rest of it, you know, because this isn't the last time that we're going to encounter this, even in ShakeTube. Although I think ShakeTube is largely going to avoid it, except for Othello. I think we're doing Othello. And if we do Othello, this subject will come up again. But one way or another, it was a delight to reread this thing. It was a delight that was shaded and shadowed a bit by Erik's video and the comments to Erik's video, because it distresses me greatly to think that there's a generation of readers, approaching the age where they will be going to graduate school and then getting into teaching positions, that might agree that we need to remake the Western canon in order to contour to our current moralities. That would distress me greatly. That would be a great loss, and a huge disservice to the young people who would be taught by such teachers. There's bad trigger warnings are bad enough, but just removing the stuff completely because it doesn't agree with what you didn't even know was right until you were 21. That's obviously I could rant like this for some time, but I don't want to lose sight of The Merchant of Venice because it is such a delightful play. Not just the Shylock parts. There's a lot more going on. Portia herself is a great dramatic creation. So I'll wrap it up for now. I had a great time rereading it. It was in ShakeTube 2017. It was our first quote unquote problematic Shakespeare play, and I loved it all the more for that. So I look forward to hearing what the rest of you have to say, and we move on from here next time. I'll see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.